She said yes in 10 seconds. 10 seconds to shatter a promise she had kept for 27 years that she would never let any man get close enough to hurt her. And he only needed 10 seconds after she turned away to throw his head back, laugh with his friends, and say, "See? Fat girls never get asked out. The second you do, they say yes. Easiest bet of my life." She was standing right behind him. She heard every word, every laugh. She did not cry. She turned around, walked straight toward him, and what happened in the next 30 seconds would drag into her life the most powerful man in the city. An 11-year-old debt no one had ever collected, and a faded school ID photo tucked inside the wallet of a man that no one on the South Side dared to say the name of. If you are new to this channel, subscribe before this story begins, because once it starts, you will not want to stop. Jolene Webb was 27 years old and worked as the receptionist for a small real estate company tucked at the far end of a quiet street on the west side of Chicago. Every morning she arrived 15 minutes early, made coffee for the whole office, arranged appointments, and answered the phone in a cheerful voice she had practiced so thoroughly that it had become a reflex. She was fat, not in the slightly rounded way people softened with the word full, figured to make it sound kinder. She was fat in the way that, when she walked into a room, that was the first thing people saw before they saw her smile, before they heard her voice, before they had the chance to know who she was. And Jolene knew that. She had known it for a very long time. At work, she was the person everyone liked but no one truly saw. She made the best coffee, remembered every birthday, knew who liked soy milk and who liked heavy cream, knew who was fighting with his wife and who was waiting for test results. She knew it all because she watched, and she watched because she was used to standing at the edge. Sometimes, when she walked past the inner row of desks, she heard whispers that weren't quite soft enough. They weren't always cruel. Sometimes they were only passing comments, the kind that sounded like, "Poor Jolene, she's sweet, and if she could just lose a few pounds, she'd be perfect." The kind of sentence the speaker believed was polite, while the one hearing it carried it around for the rest of the week. Jolene didn't react. She smiled. She always smiled. That was the weapon she had forged since childhood, a wide, quick smile that arrived before any words could land on her. If she smiled first, other people had no chance to turn her into a joke, because she had already turned herself into one before they could. She joked about her weight at lunch. She called herself the extra-large version when someone invited her to go shopping. She laughed louder than anyone else in the room, always, and no one in that office knew that every joke she made about herself had real weight, that each one took away a small piece from inside her that she never got back. Jolene grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, in a family where a daughter's value was measured quite literally by a scale. Her mother wasn't a bad woman. She was the kind of woman who had lived her whole life believing that the world was only kind to slender girls, and she passed that belief to her daughter not because she wanted to hurt her, but because she thought that was how she could protect her. But to a child, the difference between protection and pain is sometimes so thin it can't be seen. Jolene grew up with the idea that she had to change something about herself before she deserved to be loved, and because she couldn't change it, she concluded that she didn't deserve it. She didn't resent her mother. She understood her mother, but understanding doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. From that, Jolene wrote herself a rule she never told anyone. The rule was very simple. If a man said she was beautiful, he was lying. If a man said he liked her, he had another motive. If a man seemed interested, she waited, because sooner or later he would leave, and she wanted to be ready for that moment instead of being surprised by it. That rule kept her safe for 27 years, safe and lonely. She had discovered that those two things sometimes looked exactly the same. Every evening, Jolene returned to her one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor, locked the door, slipped off the shoes that had started hurting her feet by the 2nd hour of the workday, sat down on the old sofa, and did nothing at all. She didn't turn on the television. She didn't call anyone. She simply sat there in the silence and let the exhaustion seep out of her. Not exhaustion from work, exhaustion from smiling all day, exhaustion from pretending the whispers didn't touch her, exhaustion from having to live inside a body the world had already decided wasn't good enough, and then waking up every morning pretending she didn't agree with them, when deep down, in the place she never let anyone see, she wasn't sure she truly disagreed. That was Jolene Webb before Trent Holloway appeared, a 27-year-old woman who had perfected the art of disappearing, turning herself into someone everyone liked but no one really remembered, Someone everyone laughed with, but no one ever asked whether she was truly happy. She lived that way, safe behind the wall she had built with her own hands, and she had almost accepted that this was all she would ever have. Then Trent walked in. At the same time, Jolene was sitting on the old sofa in her dark apartment, 15 minutes away by car. Kendrick Shaw was seated at the last table in the private room of the restaurant that bore his name. Across from him sat a man named Walton, the owner of a transport company that had been doing business with Kendrick for 3 years and had decided today that he was important enough to change the terms. Walton talked for 7 minutes. He explained, justified, and laid out figures he thought would impress. Kendrick listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't nod. He didn't touch the glass of water in front of him. He only looked at Walton with the eyes that anyone who had ever sat across from Kendrick Shaw described in exactly the same way. The eyes of a man counting how many more sentences you've got left before I say the only sentence I need to say. Walton stopped. Kendrick let the silence hang in the room long enough for Walton to begin sweating at his temples. Then Kendrick spoke. Slowly, softly, in a voice that made the listener lean forward just to hear him clearly. Walton, you've got 3 days to deliver exactly what you promised. On the 4th day, I'll find someone else. And you know what it means when I find someone else. Walton left the restaurant without another word. Kendrick Shaw was 33 years old. On paper, he was the owner of a chain of 3 restaurants in Chicago. Legal revenue, taxes fully paid, a successful businessman whom the local magazine had interviewed twice. Off paper, he controlled most of the business that moved through the shadows of the South Side. He wasn't the kind of crime boss people saw in movies, the kind who wore a white suit and smoked cigars beside a swimming pool. Kendrick wore black shirts, drove cars that didn't stand out too much, and lived in a penthouse that from the outside looked like any other luxury apartment. He didn't like attention. He liked control. And those 2 things, he had learned very early, never came together. People feared Kendrick not because he was violent. He never shouted, never threatened anyone with cheap words. People feared him because he was the kind of man who spoke once, never repeated himself, and always did exactly what he said he would do. In his world, that was more frightening than any gun. After Walton left, his closest lieutenant stepped in, set a glass of whiskey on the table, and said, "Kessler's moving merchandise again near 5th Avenue. Kendrick gave one nod. He didn't ask another question. He didn't give an order. Just that nod. The kind of nod from a man who had taken note and would deal with it when he decided to deal with it, not when someone else tried to force his hand. The room emptied. Kendrick sat there alone. And in that moment, when no one was watching, when he didn't need to control anything, he did something no one in his organization knew he did. He opened his wallet. Between the bills, tucked neatly into the smallest compartment, was a student identification photo. Old, faded, the corner curled and slightly yellowed with time. In the photo was a 16-year-old girl, her hair tied off to one side, her face round, looking straight into the camera with the kind of expression children wear when they haven't yet learned how to pose for an identification picture. 11 years earlier, this girl had been the only person who stopped when his mother was lying on the sidewalk after an accident. A dozen people passed by. No one stopped. Only this girl did. Kendrick didn't know her name, didn't know where she lived. The photo had fallen from her pocket in the middle of the panic, and it was the only thing his mother had managed to keep. She gave it to Kendrick when she was discharged from the hospital and said, "Find her. I owe her my life." Kendrick had searched, many times, by every method a man with power like his could use. But a faded identification photo of a 16-year-old girl with no name, no school, no address, in a city of millions, was a needle in the ocean. He hadn't found her, but he didn't throw the picture away. He kept it in his wallet, carried it every day, for 11 years. Not because of romance. Kendrick Shaw wasn't romantic. He kept it because he was a man who refused to owe anyone. Every debt in his life, whether money, favor, or grievance, he paid in full. Only this debt remained. The debt owed to a nameless girl he had never seen again. He looked at the photo for a few seconds. The round face, the direct eyes, the look of someone who didn't know fear or hadn't yet learned how to fear. Then he folded the wallet shut, slipped it into his inner pocket, stood up, and walked out of the restaurant. Outside, Chicago at night was cold and noisy in its own way. Kendrick drove home in silence. 11 years. He still hadn't found her. Trent Holloway was 29 years old, sold cars at a dealership on Western Avenue, and he was good at it. Not because he understood cars, because he understood people. He knew exactly when to smile, when to tilt his head, when to lightly touch a customer's shoulder as though they were an old friend. Trent was the kind of man every room turned toward the moment he walked in, not because he mattered, but because he knew how to take up space. He was handsome in an effortless way, the kind of handsome man who knew he was handsome and used it like a tool, the same way he used his smile, his voice, and the smooth confidence he put on every morning along with his cologne. One Friday night, Trent sat with his group of friends, 4 men who had known one another since college, the kind of group that met every week to drink, talk loudly, and try to prove whose life was more interesting. Trent was talking about the real estate office where he had stopped by to deliver paperwork for a customer buying a car on installment. He spoke in the voice of a man getting ready for the best part of the story. "There's this receptionist there," Trent said. "Every time I go in, she grins from ear to ear. I'll bet $500 that all I have to do is ask her out in front of a crowd, and she'll say yes on the spot. No thinking, no dating, just ask. She's the type who's never had anyone ask before, so if you ask, she'll take it immediately." His friends laughed. One of them asked, "500 for real?" in a voice that was half disbelief and half interest. Another shook his head but still laughed, the kind of shake from someone who knew it was wrong but didn't care enough to say so. No one stopped him. No one said, "Don't do that." Trent looked around the table, saw no objection strong enough to matter, and took that as agreement. The following week, Trent began showing up at Jolene's office more often than necessary. He brought her coffee every morning, exactly the kind she drank, because he had asked the barista at the coffee shop on the corner before stopping by. He texted her in the evening, short, pleasant messages, the kind that said, "How was your day?" or "Thinking about you." He called her different and special in the same voice he had used to sell hundreds of cars, a voice that made the person listening feel like the only one in the room. Jolene didn't believe it right away. She wasn't the kind of person who believed right away. For the first 2 weeks, she accepted the coffee, but didn't text back. She thanked him, but kept her distance. Inside her, the rule she had lived by for 27 years was still at work, still reminding her that this wasn't real, that this man wanted something, that sooner or later he would leave, and she would once again be sitting alone on that old sofa. But Trent didn't leave. By the 3rd week, he was still bringing coffee, still texting, still smiling when he saw her, with the kind of smile he had practiced thousands of times on thousands of customers, and yet still made look natural in a way that was almost frightening. And Jolene, slowly, carefully, began to open the door she had kept shut for 27 years. Not fling it wide, just open it a little. Enough to let the light come in. Enough for her to begin thinking, only thinking, that maybe she had been wrong. Maybe not everyone only saw her wait. Maybe someone truly saw her. One night, Jolene lay on her bed holding her phone, opening the message thread with Corinne, her only close friend at the office. She typed, "There's someone. I think he might really like me." Then she deleted it, typed it again, deleted it again. She looked at the words a 3rd time and wondered why writing such a simple sentence felt so hard. Because typing it meant admitting something. Admitting that she was hoping, and hope, for Jolene, had always been the most dangerous thing of all. She sent it. Corinne replied immediately with a string of emojis. Jolene didn't even finish reading. She set the phone down and smiled. Not the smile she wore at the office, the shield smile. The smile that came before anyone else had the chance to speak. But the kind of smile that was small and private, the kind she kept for herself, hidden in the darkness of the room, where no one could see it and no one could take it away. She didn't know that smile was worth exactly $500. Jolene's company held its year-end party at a large restaurant downtown, the kind of restaurant with a wide outdoor terrace and enough space for 200 people to stand without brushing shoulders. Jolene arrived with Corinne. She wore the dress she had tried on 7 times in front of the mirror the night before, not because she liked changing clothes, but because the first 6 times she looked at her reflection and heard that old voice in her head telling her that no dress could hide the thing people would always see first. The 7th time, she looked at herself and told herself that tonight she wouldn't listen to that voice. Tonight she would try. Trent arrived 20 minutes late. He walked in with the kind of stride Jolene had already come to know, the stride of a man who knew he was being watched and liked it. He found her in the crowd, smiled when he saw her, with the kind of smile she had doubted 4 weeks earlier but had now begun to believe. He took her hand, led her into the middle of the terrace, and Jolene let him lead her because she had no reason not to. She didn't know that at a table in the far corner, 3 men sitting together, Trent's friends, had arrived early. She didn't know that one of them was holding a phone with the camera already open. Trent stopped in the middle of the terrace. Around them were Jolene's co-workers, guests, people she knew and people she didn't. About 200 people. Trent looked at her, held both her hands, and spoke loudly enough for the nearest people to hear. He said she was the most special person he had ever met. He said no one had ever made him feel this way before. He said he wanted the whole world to know, and that was why he had chosen to say here, in front of everyone, that he loved her. 200 people fell silent, the kind of silence that only happens when a large crowd holds its breath all at once. And Jolene stood there. Her hands were in Trent's hands, warm, and she looked into his eyes, and she wanted to believe. She wanted to believe so badly that she could feel the rule of 27 years shaking inside her, crying out, "Don't, this isn't real. Every man has a motive." But at the same time, another part of her, the part that was exhausted by loneliness, the part worn thin from guarding herself every single day, that part whispered, "If not now, then when? If not this man, then who? How long have you already waited? And how much longer are you supposed to wait?" She nodded. Not with reason, with something deeper, something that had been locked away for a very long time and had finally found a way out today. She said yes, and her voice didn't tremble, and that surprised her, because she had thought it would. The crowd burst open. Applause, whistles, someone shouting congratulations from the table on the right. Corinne stood 3 meters away, both hands over her mouth, crying, the kind of crying that comes from a best friend who has watched you keep the door closed for years and is seeing it open for the first time. Jolene smiled. And this smile was different from every smile she had smiled in 27 years. It wasn't a shield. It wasn't a reflex of self-defense. It wasn't the kind of smile that came first, so no one else had the chance to hurt her. It was only a smile, simple, real, and for the first time in her life, it carried no weight at all. Trent held her. The crowd kept clapping, and in that moment, Jolene allowed herself to believe completely, holding nothing back, leaving no part of herself standing guard in the corner of the room. She believed with everything she had, and that was exactly why what happened next would destroy her down to the roots. Because she didn't nod with half of herself. She nodded with all of herself. And when a person gives everything, and then discovers that the one receiving it thought it was a joke, there is no piece large enough left to pick back up. Jolene stepped out of Trent's arms, told him to wait, then walked inside to get her phone. She wanted to call her mother. She wanted to tell her mother that a man had just stood before 200 people and said he loved her. And she had said yes, and this time it was real. She walked away, and her steps felt light in a way she couldn't remember ever having felt before, as though gravity had been cut in half, as though something she had carried on her shoulders for 27 years had just been lifted away. She didn't know she was about to pick it up again, 10 times heavier. Jolene picked up her phone from the table inside, opened her contacts, and found her mother's number. Her finger hovered over the call button. She wanted to hear her mother's voice. She wanted to say, "Mom, I have someone who loves me," and hear her mother fall silent for a few seconds before asking, "Is it true?" In that voice Jolene knew so well, a voice half joyful and half afraid to believe. She smiled to herself, slipped the phone back into her pocket, then stepped outside to return to Trent. She walked around the back of the dining area, taking the shortcut through the corner of the terrace where a low hedge separated the guest space from the staff walkway, and she heard Trent's voice, not the voice he had used with her 10 minutes earlier, not the voice that had said, "You are the most special person I have ever met." A different voice. His real voice. The one he used when she wasn't there, relaxed, laughing, the voice of a man who had just completed a deal and was now recounting it to his team. She stopped. Not because she wanted to eavesdrop, but because her feet stopped on their own, as though her body recognized something before her mind could process it. "Told you," Trent said, his voice bright and easy, the voice of someone enjoying the moment. "Easiest thing in my life. Didn't need 3 or 6 months of dating. A few weeks of buying coffee, a few texts, done." She said yes right away. Laughter. Not just one person. Several. The laughter of men amused because their friend had just won a game. One of them said, You acted so well I almost believed it myself. Trent laughed louder. Easiest $500 I've ever made. That girl has never had anyone look at her. So the moment some guy does, that's it. She believes. She's ready to give everything. And then he added one more sentence. The last sentence. The one Jolene would carry with her long after that night. You know what? Overweight girls are the most pitiful in that way. They feel grateful when someone is willing to confess to them, so they never say no. Jolene stood behind the hedge, less than 5 meters from Trent. She heard every word, every syllable, every burst of laughter threaded through the sentences. And she didn't cry, not because she was strong, but because what was happening inside her wasn't tears. It was something else, something slower, deeper, heavier, as though each word Trent had spoken was moving through every layer she had opened over the past 4 weeks. Every layer she had spent 27 years building and had only just lowered, and now each word was touching the place inside her she had never let anyone touch. The softest place, the place she had guarded most carefully, the place she had just handed to a man who treated it like a $500 joke. She looked down at her hand, her right hand, the hand Trent had held 10 minutes earlier. Still warm. She remembered the feeling when he held it. Steady, warm, and she had thought it was real because hands don't lie. Now she understood she was wrong. The hands of a good actor can act just as well. Everything can be performed. Eyes can perform. Voices can perform. Warmth can perform. And she, who had spent 27 years learning to tell truth from falsehood, hadn't been able to tell the difference. Not because she was foolish, but because she had wanted to believe too much. And when someone wants to believe too much, they will find proof for it everywhere they look. She stood there for how long? She didn't know. Maybe 30 seconds. Maybe a minute. Time lost its shape when something inside a person is collapsing. Around her, the party went on. Music still played. People still laughed and talked. No one knew. No one saw her standing behind the hedge in that thin strip of darkness. Her hands still warm while inside she was turning cold millimeter by millimeter. She thought of her mother. Of the call she had almost made. Of the words, "Mom, I have someone who loves me," that she had prepared in her mind. She imagined saying them. And now those words sounded like a joke. Not her joke, Trent's joke, and she had almost brought that joke to her mother as a gift. She clenched her hand. The warmth from Trent's touch hadn't fully faded. She hated that. She hated that her body still held the trace of something false while inside her. The only real thing, the small fragile belief she had just dared to hold, lay shattered on the ground in pieces. Jolene took a breath. And then she did something Jolene Webb of 4 weeks earlier wouldn't have done. The Jolene of 4 weeks ago would have turned away. She would have gone home, locked the door, sat on the sofa, and handled everything alone in the dark the way she always had. But the Jolene of tonight, the Jolene who had opened her heart and been betrayed, the Jolene with something burning inside her, hotter than tears, that Jolene didn't turn away. She turned back and walked straight toward Trent. Jolene stepped around the hedge and walked straight toward Trent. She didn't run. She didn't hesitate. It was the walk of someone who had already made her decision and didn't need another second to think again. Trent was standing with his back to her, still laughing, still talking, drink in hand, shoulder angled toward his friends, with the relaxed posture of a man standing in the middle of his own audience. His friends saw her first. One stopped laughing in the middle of it. Another lowered his glass. And that kind of silence, that sudden silence when a group of people laughing all stop at once, made Trent turn around. He saw her face, and he knew, instantly. She didn't have to say a single word. The smile on his face died the way a candle dies when a hard gust of wind hits it. Not slowly, not gently, but all at once. He opened his mouth, maybe to say something, maybe to explain, maybe to turn it into a misunderstanding, with the same mouth he had used to sell cars and sell lies his whole life. Jolene slapped him, one slap only, with her right hand, the same hand still warm from when he had held it. The sound was loud enough to make the 4 nearest tables turn around, loud enough for the music to seem to drop for a beat, loud enough for everyone within 10 meters to know something had just happened. Jolene looked straight at Trent's face and spoke in a voice that didn't shake, didn't rise, didn't shout. A voice so flat and clear it was more frightening than any scream. "We're done. Keep your $500. Consider it payment for the performance." She said it and stopped. She said nothing more. She didn't wait for him to answer. She had already said everything she needed to say, and she didn't owe him another syllable. But Trent Holloway wasn't the kind of man who could endure humiliation in front of his friends. He was a man who lived by image, by always being the one in control in every room. And now he was standing before 3 friends, face red from a slap, made into a joke by the very girl he had treated like a joke. His ego couldn't bear it. He stepped forward and shoved Jolene. She fell to the ground. 200 people at the party, the music still playing, someone laughing at a table farther away because they didn't know what was happening. But the people nearby knew. They saw a girl on the ground, a man standing over her, and no one did anything. A few people looked and then turned away. The quick turn of people who didn't want to get dragged into trouble. A few stood there with drinks in their hands, watching, but their feet didn't move. Not one hand reached out. Not one voice spoke. 200 people and Jolene was on the ground alone. The back door of the restaurant opened. Kendrick Shaw stepped outside. He had just finished meeting with a business partner in the private room inside, his restaurant, the one that had rented the outdoor terrace for the event that night. He came out to get his car and go home, and he saw it. A girl on the ground, a man standing over her with a face twisted by anger and humiliation, and a crowd standing there watching without moving. Kendrick walked forward, not fast, not slow, the walk of a man who didn't need to hurry because he knew he would arrive, and when he arrived, everything would change. He stopped in front of Trent. He didn't speak at once. He looked at Trent with the eyes anyone on the south side would recognize. The eyes people whispered were the last thing many men saw before their lives changed forever. Trent looked back, and for one moment, Jolene saw his face change. Not fear, something deeper than fear. Recognition. He recognized the man standing in front of him. Trent's friends recognized him too. She could see that in the way one of them took half a step backward without realizing he was stepping back. Kendrick said only one sentence. Very softly, very briefly. Leave. Trent left. His friends left with him. Quickly, without looking back. The kind of leaving people do when they don't need to be told twice. Kendrick looked down at Jolene. She was still sitting on the ground. Not because she couldn't stand, but because in the last 15 seconds, too many things had happened, and her body hadn't caught up yet. He held out his hand. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't look at her with pity. He only offered his hand, palm up, in silence, and waited. She looked at that hand for 1 second. Then she took it, stood up. He waited until she was steady on her feet, then let go. He meant to leave. He had already turned his back, but something made him stop. He looked back at her face, only for an instant. And inside Kendrick Shaw, in the deepest place where very little ever managed to reach, something stirred. Her face was familiar. Not familiar in the way of having seen someone somewhere before. Familiar in the way of a face he had looked at many times, but in another form, younger, smaller. He wasn't sure. Not sure enough to say it aloud. He gave Jolene a small nod, the kind of nod that stood in for a greeting, then walked away. On his way to the parking lot, Kendrick opened his wallet. He pulled out the old student identification photo and looked at it beneath the streetlight. The round face, the direct eyes. Then he looked back toward the girl who had just risen to her feet on the restaurant terrace. The party lights fell across her face from a distance, and he saw it again. Something in the lines of her face, in the way she looked straight ahead without lowering her gaze, in the expression of someone used to enduring, but not used to bowing her head. He put the photo away, got into the car, didn't start the engine right away. He sat in the dark for a moment, thinking. Then he took out his phone, called one of his men, and said, "Find me information on the receptionist at the real estate company that rented the restaurant terrace tonight." He ended the call, started the car, drove away, and Jolene, standing on the restaurant terrace with her legs slightly trembling and an emptiness spreading through her inside, had no idea that the man who had just offered his hand and helped her stand was the most powerful crime boss on Chicago's South Side. And she knew even less that he had just seen in her something he had been searching for over 11 years. 48 hours after that night, an envelope lay on Kendrick's desk in the office behind the restaurant. Inside was everything his men had found. Jolene Webb, 27 years old, born in the suburbs of Chicago, raised by a single mother, average student in public school, no criminal record, no major debt, receptionist for a small real estate company on the west side of the city. A salary just enough to cover the rent on a one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor. Her whole life fit neatly into 3 pages, the kind of life no one notices, unless they have a specific reason to go looking. But on the last page, there was one line that made Kendrick stop. 11 years earlier, a 16-year-old girl named Jolene Webb had been the only person to stop at the scene of a car accident on Ashland. The victim was a woman named Ruth Shaw. The girl called emergency services and stayed with the victim until the ambulance arrived. Ruth Shaw, his mother. Kendrick read the line twice, not because he didn't understand it, but because he needed to be certain he wasn't seeing what he wanted to see. He took the old photograph from his wallet and set it beside the current photograph of Jolene in the file. The old picture, faded, corner-curled, showed a 16-year-old girl with a round face and hair tied to one side, looking straight into the camera. The new picture, printed on white paper, showed a 27-year-old woman whose face had changed with time, but whose eyes hadn't. Direct eyes. The eyes of someone who looked at the world without lowering her gaze, even though the world had given her many reasons to bow her head. The same person. 11 years. Kendrick leaned back in his chair. He was a man who had built an empire on his ability to read people, read situations, know who was telling the truth, and who was lying within seconds. But now he sat there feeling something he didn't have a word for. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was closer to the feeling of finding something that had been lost for a very long time, and discovering it hadn't been far away at all. It had been right here, 15 minutes from him by car, living in a 3rd-floor apartment, making coffee for coworkers every morning, and just days ago turned into a joke by a man who sold cars in front of 200 people. He called his mother. Ruth Shaw answered on the 2nd ring. She didn't ask why her son was calling at 10 o'clock at night because she was used to it. Kendrick's work didn't follow office hours, and she had long since stopped asking questions she didn't want the answers to. Kendrick said, "I found her. The girl from that year. The girl who stayed with you on Ashland." On the other end of the line, there was silence. A long silence. The kind that belongs to a person who has just heard the thing they have waited 11 years to hear, and now that it has truly come, doesn't know how to respond. Then Ruth spoke, her voice soft but clear, the voice of a woman who had lived long enough to know there are some things that mustn't be left waiting any longer. "Find her. Bring her to me." Kendrick ended the call. He looked again at the file on the desk. 3 pages. A life so ordinary it was nearly invisible. But within that ordinary life had been a moment no ordinary person would have chosen. A dozen people passed along Ashland that day. No one stopped. Only a 16-year-old girl stopped, knelt beside an older woman lying on the sidewalk, and stayed. That act probably took no more than 20 minutes from the girl's life, but it had given Ruth Shaw 11 more years to live. It had given Kendrick Shaw 11 more years with his mother. And now the most powerful crime boss on Chicago's South Side stood before a debt that no amount of money, no amount of power, nothing he possessed could ever truly repay. Because how do you repay someone who saved your mother when no one else even bothered to stop? How do you repay someone when, by the time you finally find her, she is lying on the ground in the courtyard of your own restaurant, and again no one bothers to offer a hand? Kendrick closed the file. He knew what he was going to do. He didn't yet know exactly how he would do it, but he knew this much. Jolene Webb would never again have to lie on the ground alone, not while he still knew who she was. In the days that followed, small things began changing around Jolene in ways she couldn't explain. Her boss, who had previously started hinting that maybe she should take a few days off until everything settled down, suddenly stopped mentioning it and treated her as though nothing had happened. 2 coworkers who used to talk behind her back became unusually polite. A regular client who once gave a faint little smile whenever he saw her come to collect paperwork only nodded this time and stayed quiet. Jolene noticed. She didn't know why, but she noticed that some hand was rearranging things around her from behind the curtain, gently, without leaving fingerprints, the kind of hand belonging to someone used to making things happen without anyone knowing. She didn't know that Kendrick Shaw had made a phone call to the owner of the real estate company where she worked, a man Kendrick had done business with for years. And in that call, Kendrick hadn't asked for much, only said that the receptionist named Jolene Webb wasn't to be bothered by anyone, and the company owner, who understood perfectly well that when Kendrick Shaw suggested something it wasn't a suggestion at all, understood immediately. But Kendrick couldn't control everything, and the thing he couldn't control was beginning in a cluttered apartment on the other side of the city, where Trent Holloway sat in front of a laptop screen with a rage he didn't know where to put. Trent wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat. He wasn't the kind of man who got slapped in front of his friends, got chased off by a single look, then went home and forgot it. He was the kind of man who lay in bed replaying the moment he had been humiliated, letting the anger ferment in the dark until it turned into action. One of Trent's friends had recorded the proposal video that night. It was filmed in a public place, at an open event, where anyone could record. Trent took that video, cut it together, added commentary beneath it, added lines of text running across the screen. He didn't use Jolene's name, but he didn't need to, because her face was right there in the video, clear as day, and anyone who knew her recognized her immediately. He posted it on social media with a caption he thought was funny, a caption about how easy it was to get someone to say yes when you wanted them to. The video spread faster than anything Trent had ever posted before, not because it was good, but because the internet is always hungry for the kind of thing that lets people laugh without thinking about who is being hurt. In the first 48 hours, the video was shared thousands of times. The comments flooded in. People tagged friends. People wrote things they would never have dared say directly to someone's face. Things about appearance, about weight, about that tone of poor thing that wasn't really pity at all, only a way for people to feel superior. Jolene was called by all kinds of nicknames. Nicknames she would never type anywhere because they didn't deserve to be repeated. Corinne called her on the morning of the second day after the video went online. Corinne's voice was urgent. "Jolene, don't go online. Don't read the comments. Don't open it." But Jolene had already opened it. She had already read them. Every line, every comment. She scrolled all the way to the bottom and read everything without missing a single one, as though she needed to know exactly what the world thought of her, needed to hear every word, needed to make sure she didn't miss a single stone being thrown in her direction. Not because she liked pain, but because for Jolene, knowing exactly how much she was being hurt had always felt easier than guessing. During the following week, clients coming into the office began recognizing her. Not all of them, but enough. One man laughed when he saw her at the reception desk. Another asked, "Are you the girl in the video?" in a tone he believed was neutral but was in truth cruel. Jolene sat at the front desk, smiling, answering phones, arranging appointments, while inside her the last pieces of self-respect she still had were being carved away day by day. That Friday, she went into her boss's office and said she was taking leave. She wasn't fired. Her boss even told her to stay. But Jolene said no. She didn't offer a long explanation. She only said that she needed to go, and she left. Because Jolene Webb was the kind of person who would rather leave on her own 2 feet than sit there and let people laugh in her face every day and call that endurance. She didn't endure. She chose, and she chose to go. That night, Jolene sat in her 3rd-floor apartment, door locked, lights off. Her phone face down on the table, still vibrating at steady intervals because the comments still hadn't stopped. She didn't turn on the light. She didn't turn on the television. She sat on the old sofa, in the exact place where she sat every evening after coming home from work. But tonight she hadn't come home from work. Tonight she no longer had anywhere to come home from. She sat in the dark and didn't cry. She had already cried enough in the previous days. Tonight she only sat there. And in the silence of the room, a thought moved quietly through her mind, slow and heavy, the kind of thought she knew was wrong but didn't have enough strength to push away. Maybe she really wasn't enough. Maybe the world hadn't seen her wrong. Maybe she had seen herself wrong when she thought she deserved more than this. She sat with that thought for a long time, and on the other side of the city, Kendrick Shaw had just gotten word about the video. Kendrick watched the video once. Only once. He sat in the office behind the restaurant, the phone lying on the desk, the screen lit, and he watched it from beginning to end without touching the screen, without fast-forwarding, without pausing. He watched Jolene's face in the video, the moment she nodded, the moment she smiled, the moment she believed. Then he read the caption beneath it, read the first comments, and stopped, not because he couldn't bear it. Kendrick Shaw had seen worse things than this in his life. He stopped because he had seen enough. He turned off the screen, set the phone down, and sat still for a while. He didn't get angry, didn't slam his hand on the table, didn't shout. He simply went cold. The kind of cold that the people who had stayed near him for years all knew was more frightening than any rage. Because when Kendrick Shaw was angry, at least he was still reacting. When he went cold, he was calculating. He made one phone call. Brief. Bring Trent Holloway to my restaurant. Tonight. After closing. At 11 o'clock that night, the restaurant was closed. The tables and chairs sat empty. Most of the lights were off, and only a dim glow remained in the far inside corner where Kendrick sat, alone, a glass of water on the table that he hadn't touched. Outside the door to the room, 2 of Kendrick's men stood on either side in silence, as though they were extensions of the wall itself. They didn't need to come inside. Their presence outside the door was enough. Trent walked in. He hadn't been forced by violence. Kendrick's men had found him at a bar and said Kendrick Shaw wanted to see him. And Trent, though he didn't want to, though he still remembered those eyes at the party, had gone with them, because Trent was smart enough to know that when Kendrick Shaw invited you, refusing was worse than going. He stepped through the door of the darkened restaurant and saw Kendrick sitting at the far table, alone, the room empty, silent enough that Trent could hear the sound of his own shoes on the wooden floor. He looked around, saw no one else, but he knew that behind that door, behind those walls, there were men he didn't want to meet. And he knew that standing here, in a closed restaurant, at 11 o'clock at night, in front of Kendrick Shaw, wasn't a conversation. It was a trial where the judge, the jury, and the executioner were all the same man. Sit, Kendrick said. One word. Not loud, not soft. Exactly the volume of a man who doesn't need to repeat himself. Trent sat, the chair across from Kendrick. The distance between them was close enough for Trent to see Kendrick's eyes clearly, and just far enough for Trent to understand that the space wasn't accidental. It had been arranged to make him feel small. Kendrick didn't speak right away. He let the silence move through the room, let it fill every corner, let Trent sit inside it and feel it growing heavier. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. 30 seconds without a sound except Trent's breathing, faster than normal. Then Kendrick said, "What time did you post that video?" Trent opened his mouth. "Listen, Kendrick raised one finger. Only one. And Trent stopped in the middle of the sentence as though someone had switched off his voice. "I'm not asking for a reason," Kendrick said. "I'm asking what time." Trent swallowed. "Around 9 o'clock at night, 2 days ago." Kendrick nodded, slowly, as though he was filing the information into some place inside his mind that Trent didn't want to know existed. "Is the video still online?" Kendrick asked. "Yes. Did you film it or did someone else?" "My friend filmed it. I only posted it. How many views does it have now?" Trent didn't answer right away. He knew the number. He knew because he had checked it every hour, had watched the views climb with the sick pleasure of someone who had set fire to something and stood there enjoying the burn. But now, saying that number out loud in front of Kendrick Shaw, he understood that every view was one more reason he might not leave this room intact. Kendrick didn't wait for the answer. He leaned forward only a few inches, just enough for Trent to feel that the air between them had tightened. "You've got 12 hours, Kendrick said, his voice as flat and calm as water with a depth beneath it that had no visible bottom. 12 hours to erase everything. The video, the post, all of it. You'll post a public apology. Then you'll leave this city." He stopped, looked at Trent. "Not because I'm ordering you to. Because if you're still here after 12 hours, I won't need to give an order. People will understand on their own what to do." Trent looked at Kendrick, and in his eyes, Jolene would have seen, if she had been there, the same thing she had seen at the party when Kendrick stepped forward. Not ordinary fear. Something deeper. The recognition that he had been playing a small game while accidentally stepping onto the ground of a player operating at an entirely different level. "Go," Kendrick said. Trent stood. His legs weren't steady. He walked to the door faster than he had walked in, and he didn't look back. The door closed. The restaurant fell silent again. Kendrick sat alone at the far table, the glass of water still untouched, and he didn't feel pleased, didn't feel satisfied. He wasn't the kind of man who enjoyed frightening other people. He was simply the kind who did what had to be done and then moved on. But tonight, after Trent left, Kendrick didn't move on right away. He remained where he was, and he thought of Jolene, thought of her sitting alone in the dark apartment, door locked, phone still trembling with comments she never deserved to read. He thought of her, and he realized that something inside him had shifted in a way he never allowed it to shift. He had come here tonight because of the debt, because of his mother, because of the faded school photograph in his wallet. But now, sitting in the empty restaurant, he knew that wasn't the only reason anymore. And for a man like Kendrick Shaw, That was the most dangerous thing that could happen. 3 days after the night Kendrick met with Trent, the video vanished from the internet. A public apology appeared in its place. Brief, awkward, clearly written by someone who wasn't truly sorry, but was frightened enough to obey. Trent Holloway left Chicago, and no one knew where he went, and no one cared enough to ask. Jolene knew none of it. She was still sitting in her third-floor apartment, the lights off, the door locked, her phone powered down since 2 days earlier. She didn't know the video had been removed. She didn't know Trent was gone. She only knew that she was unemployed. She was alone, and there was nothing outside the apartment door waiting for her. Then Kendrick called. She didn't know where he had gotten her number, and she didn't ask. He spoke briefly, in a voice that didn't allow refusal, but didn't sound like an order either. "Someone wants to meet you. I'll pick you up at 3 o'clock this afternoon." She wanted to say no. She wanted to say that she didn't want to see anyone, didn't want to leave the house, didn't want anyone to look at her. But there was something in Kendrick's voice, not warmth. He wasn't a warm man, but certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from someone who has already decided this is going to happen and is only informing you of it. She said, "Okay." Kendrick's car stopped in front of a quiet house in a residential neighborhood on the south side of the city. Not a mansion, not an impressive house. An ordinary home with a porch and wooden steps. Jolene looked at the house and then at Kendrick. "Who wants to see me?" He didn't answer. He only stepped out, walked around to open her door, and waited. Inside, sitting at the kitchen table, was a small woman with silver hair, a straight back, and the sharp eyes of someone who had lived long enough not to need a second look to understand something. Ruth Shaw. She watched Jolene walk in through the kitchen door, and she said nothing. Didn't stand up, didn't greet her. She only looked at Jolene's face, looked at her eyes, looked at the way she stood, shoulders slightly drawn in, the posture of someone trying to make herself smaller so she would take up less space. She looked for a few seconds. Then her eyes changed, not slightly, completely. The kind of change that only happens when a person recognizes something they have been searching for a very long time. "My God," Ruth said, softly, almost a whisper. "It's you." Jolene didn't understand. She looked at Kendrick. He stood beside the doorway, arms folded, face unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on his mother with a look Jolene had never seen on him before. A softened look, the look of a son watching his mother on the verge of tears. Ruth stood up, slowly, because her knees weren't what they used to be, but steadily. She walked to Jolene, stopped in front of her, and took both her hands. Her own hands were small, dry, warm. She looked up into Jolene's face, because she was nearly a head shorter, and said, 11 years ago. Ashland, do you remember?" Jolene stood still, and inside her mind, something began to move, slowly, like a curtain being drawn aside to reveal a room she had closed long ago. Ashland. She was 16, walking home from school, a car out of control, a woman lying on the sidewalk, traffic passing by, no one stopping. "I was lying there," Ruth said, her voice trembling even though her eyes didn't. "I was lying on the sidewalk looking up at the sky, and I thought that was it. A dozen people passed by. Motorcycles, cars, people on foot. No one stopped. I heard footsteps passing right beside me, and no one stopped." She squeezed Jolene's hands more tightly. "Then you came, just a child. You ran over, sat down right beside me on the sidewalk, held my hand, called emergency services, and you said to me," she paused and took a breath, "you said, 'Ma'am, don't close your eyes, look at me.' And I looked at you. I looked at your face, and I didn't close my eyes. You sat there with me until the ambulance came. You didn't leave. You didn't abandon me." Jolene remembered. She remembered now. She remembered the hot sidewalk under her knees. She remembered the woman's hand gripping hers so tightly her fingers went numb. She remembered the sound of the ambulance siren far away and the relief she felt when it came closer. But she hadn't thought about that day in years. To her, it had only been one afternoon, an afternoon when she saw that someone needed help and stopped. She hadn't thought it was a big thing, hadn't thought it was something worth remembering. She had only done what was right. Ruth looked at her with eyes full of tears. "I lived because of you. My son still had his mother because of you." She said it, and the words fell into the quiet kitchen with a weight no language could measure. because it wasn't an ordinary thank you. It was a 60-year-old woman standing before a 27-year-old woman and saying, "You gave me 11 more years of life, 11 more years to watch my son grow older, 11 more years of breakfast, tea, and looking out the window in the afternoon, all the small ordinary things that people only understand the value of when they almost lose them." Jolene cried, and she didn't try to stop it. She didn't smile first to turn it into a joke. She didn't look away to hide it. She stood there in front of Ruth and cried, because for the first time in 27 years, someone was looking at her and not seeing her weight, not seeing her appearance, not seeing the dress or the hairstyle or anything else on the outside. Ruth looked at her and saw the 16-year-old girl who had sat down on the sidewalk beside a stranger when no one else would stop. Ruth looked at her and saw worth, the kind of worth no scale can measure, no comment online can erase, no $500 bet can ever touch. Ruth raised her hand and wiped the tears from Jolene's cheek with her thumb, gently, the way a grandmother wipes a grandchild's face, then said, "You don't need anyone to tell you you're beautiful in order to have value. You had value from the moment you sat down on the sidewalk beside an old woman you didn't even know." Jolene couldn't speak. She only nodded, and this nod wasn't like any other nod she had ever given in her life. On the drive back, Kendrick drove and Jolene sat in the passenger seat. Neither of them said a word. The city moved past beyond the windows, the lights, the horns, the ordinary breathing rhythm of Chicago in the afternoon. And the silence in the car wasn't heavy. For the first time between them, silence was only silence, not distance, not coldness, not caution. Just two people sitting side by side and not needing to say anything more, because everything that needed to be said had already been said by a 60-year-old woman, with her small hands holding tight and her eyes refusing to dry. 2 weeks after the meeting with Ruth, Kendrick called Jolene and told her that a business associate of his, a woman who owned a chain of furniture stores on the north side of the city, was looking for a store manager. He didn't say, "I got you a job." He said, "There's a position open. If you want it, I'll give you the number." Jolene noticed the difference. He wasn't handing her anything. He was opening a door and letting her walk through it on her own. She called, she interviewed, she got the job on her own merit. And when she called Kendrick to tell him she had been hired, he only said, "Good," then hung up. No long congratulations, no taking credit, just good. And Jolene, who had grown used to men using words to impress, realized for the first time that sometimes a single word, said at the right moment, carried more weight than an entire speech. They began seeing each other more often, not dating. Kendrick Shaw didn't know how to date. He wasn't the kind of man who called to ask, "Are you free tonight?" or made reservations at restaurants, or brought flowers. He simply appeared. He stopped by the store where Jolene worked, sometimes bringing coffee, exactly the kind she drank, caramel macchiato, oat milk, no added sugar, and she couldn't remember ever telling him what she liked. He remembered. How, she didn't know, but he remembered. Just as he remembered that she was allergic to peanuts, and the one time he took her out to eat, he had checked the menu beforehand and asked the chef about every dish without telling her he had done so. She found out when she overheard a server whisper to another that the boss had already said that table 7 was to have no peanuts in any dish. She didn't say anything then, but she took note. What Jolene began to understand, through those brief meetings, those conversations that weren't long but were never empty, was that Kendrick never commented on her appearance. Not once. He didn't tell her she was beautiful. He didn't tell her what she should wear. He didn't look at her with that pitying expression people used when they said "poor thing." He looked at her with the gaze of someone who was listening, paying attention, taking in everything she said as though it mattered. When she talked about her new job, he asked specific questions, the kind only someone truly listening would ask. When she made a joke, he didn't laugh out of politeness. He just looked at her with the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. Almost a smile, but not quite, as though his face was so accustomed to not showing expression that even a smile required effort. And Jolene, who had spent her whole life being seen for her body before anything else, realized that Kendrick was the first person who looked at her and bypassed that outer layer entirely. He didn't look at her and see her weight. He looked at her and saw her, but Jolene still kept her distance. A small distance, almost invisible, but it was there. She kept it because Trent had taught her an expensive lesson, that when someone was too good to her, when everything seemed too perfect, something was hiding behind it. She didn't doubt Kendrick the way she had doubted Trent. No, these two men were so different, that comparing them would have been an insult. But the wound Trent had left wasn't the kind that knew how to distinguish between someone worthy of trust and someone who wasn't. It only knew how to hurt, and because it still hurt, Jolene still kept her distance. One evening, after he walked her to the door of her apartment, Jolene stopped, her hand on the key, not opening the door right away. She turned and looked at Kendrick, who stood 2 steps away, hands in his pockets, his face neutral, the same face he wore everywhere. She looked at him and asked directly, because Jolene was the kind of person who would rather face a real pain than live inside a false hope. "Are you helping me because of the debt you owe your mother? Or for another reason?" Kendrick looked at her, and for half a second, Jolene saw something move across his face. Quick, almost too fast to catch. The expression of someone being asked exactly the question he wasn't ready to answer. He was silent. Not the silence he used with business partners, not the calculating silence, not the silence as a weapon. This was the silence of someone searching for words. Then he said, "At first, because of the debt. Now I don't know anymore." He said it and stopped. He didn't explain further. He didn't say because I like you, or because you matter to me, or any of the things another man might have said in that moment. He simply spoke the truth, whole, unpolished, without wrapping it in something prettier. "Now, I don't know anymore." And it was the most honest sentence Kendrick Shaw had ever said to anyone who wasn't his mother. Jolene looked at him for another second. Then she gave a small nod, opened the door, and stepped inside. She didn't smile. She didn't say thank you. But when she closed the door, she leaned back against it and stood there for a moment. And the distance she had kept over the past weeks, that small, almost invisible distance, didn't disappear, but it narrowed. Just a little, enough for her to notice. Noah Kessler wasn't the kind of man who waited. While Kendrick Shaw built his empire through silence and control, Noah built his through speed and pressure. The two of them had divided the South Side for years through an unspoken arrangement. The kind of arrangement both men knew existed even though neither had ever signed his name to it, and it had survived because both were powerful enough that the other had no desire to start a war. But lately Noah had begun pushing the boundary. The business in the Fifth Avenue area that Kendrick's lieutenant had mentioned a few weeks earlier wasn't the first time. Noah had tested the line 3 times in 2 months, each time deeper, each time closer. He was trying to see how quickly Kendrick would react. And the answer interested him, because Kendrick was reacting more slowly than usual. Noah wasn't stupid. He knew that a man like Kendrick Shaw never slowed down without reason. Something had to be pulling his attention in another direction. Noah had people look into it. It didn't take much effort. A few days of watching, a few questions asked in the right places, and the picture came into focus. Kendrick Shaw, the man everyone on the South Side knew had no weakness, was spending time with a woman, an ordinary woman, not anyone's daughter from a powerful family, not a business associate, not anyone with influence, just a woman managing a furniture store on the north side of the city, living alone in a 3rd-floor apartment, and walking home every evening by the same route. Noah sent Kendrick an envelope. Inside were 3 photographs. Jolene, walking to work. Jolene standing in front of the store. Jolene stepping into the entrance of her 3rd-floor apartment. Tucked in with them was a small handwritten note. "Cute girl. Be careful." Kendrick opened the envelope in his office in front of 2 of his men. He looked at each photograph. His face didn't change. Not a single muscle moved. He folded the pictures, slipped them back into the envelope, placed it on the desk, and continued the meeting as though nothing had happened. His men glanced at one another but didn't dare ask. The meeting ended. Everyone left. The door closed. Kendrick sat there alone. He took the envelope back out, looked again at each photograph, and this time, with no one watching, he clenched his right hand until his knuckles went white. He didn't get angry the way ordinary people got angry. He didn't throw anything, didn't curse, didn't immediately call Noah to threaten him. Kendrick Shaw's anger was the silent kind, the kind that settled to the bottom and stayed there, heavy and still, and once it began to move, everything it touched changed forever. He called his men. The order was short. From now on, someone follows Jolene at all times, 24 hours a day, no more than 2 blocks away, without letting her know. No contact, only watch and report. If anyone approaches her who isn't someone she knows, call me immediately. His lieutenant nodded and disappeared. Kendrick remained seated, looking at the photograph of Jolene walking down the street. and he understood that he had just pulled her into his world even though he had never wanted to, because his world had no place for ordinary people. And Jolene, no matter how strong she was, no matter how many times she had gotten back up, didn't belong in a world where people sent surveillance photographs as threats. That evening, he stopped by his mother's house. Ruth was sitting at the kitchen table, where she always sat, with the cup of tea she always drank at that hour. She looked at her son as he came in and knew immediately. He didn't have to say anything. She had lived with Kendrick long enough to read everything on the face he thought he kept hidden. "Something's wrong," she said, not as a question. Kendrick sat down across from her. He was quiet for a moment. Then Ruth asked, "Have you brought that girl here to visit again?" Kendrick shook his head. "Not yet." "Why not?" He stayed silent for a few seconds more, longer than usual. The kind of silence Ruth knew meant her son was wrestling with something he couldn't control. "Because I'm afraid that when she learns who I really am, she'll look at me the way everyone else does." Ruth looked at her son. The crime boss, whose name no one in the neighborhood dared speak aloud, was sitting in front of her saying that he was afraid. She took a sip of tea, set the cup down, and said in a voice gentle but firm as iron, "That girl sat down on the sidewalk beside me years ago while 100 people walked past and never stopped. Do you really think someone like that would be afraid of you?" Kendrick didn't answer. But he heard her. He always heard his mother, even when he didn't want to. He stayed a few more minutes, drank the tea Ruth poured for him without asking whether he wanted any, then stood up, kissed her forehead, and left. On the drive home, he thought about the 3 photographs in the envelope. Jolene, walking down the street. Jolene standing in front of the store. Jolene stepping into her apartment building. 3 ordinary moments in the ordinary day of an ordinary woman. But now, because of him, those 3 moments had become targets. And Kendrick knew Noah hadn't sent the photographs as a game. Noah had sent them to test him, to see how Kendrick would respond, to see how much this woman mattered. And if Kendrick did nothing, Noah would understand that she didn't matter and would stop. But if Kendrick reacted too strongly, Noah would know for certain that he had found the place where Kendrick Shaw's armor was thinnest. Kendrick held the steering wheel, staring straight at the dark road ahead, and made a decision. If Noah touched Jolene, he wouldn't send men. He wouldn't give orders from a distance. He would come himself, because there were some things he was beginning to understand that he didn't want to place in anyone else's hands. 4 days after the night, Kendrick sat drinking tea with his mother. Noah made his move. Jolene got off work late, close to 9 o'clock at night, because the end-of-month inventory had run longer than expected. She locked up the store, slung her bag over her shoulder, and walked home by the same route she took every day. The route passed 2 blocks and then into the narrow alley that led to the stairs of her apartment building. It was fully dark by then. Some streetlights worked, and some didn't. She walked faster than usual because of the cold, her earbuds in, her mind still on the inventory report she needed to finish in the morning. She turned into the alley and saw a black car parked across the entrance. Engine off, lights off, but both doors opened at the same time. 2 men stepped out, not in a hurry, not running. They moved with the easy pace of men who knew they didn't need to rush, because the person in front of them had nowhere to go. They came toward Jolene and stopped about 3 steps away. One was tall, one shorter, and neither face held anything worth reading. The taller one looked at Jolene and said in a normal voice, as if he were sending a casual message to a friend, "Tell Shaw that the next time he wants to touch Kessler's territory, he should remember I know where this girl is." Jolene didn't understand. She didn't know who Shaw was. She didn't know who Kessler was. She only knew that 2 strange men were blocking her in a dark alley and had just called her "this girl," as though she were an object in a bargain she hadn't known she was part of. Her heart began to pound. Her legs wanted to step back, but the wall was behind her. She gripped the strap of her bag, not because she thought the bag would protect her, but because it was the only thing she had to hold on to. Then she heard footsteps, behind the 2 men, slow, even, unhurried footsteps, the kind of footsteps she had heard once before, at the party, on the night she was on the ground, and a hand had reached out to her. Kendrick stepped out of the darkness at the mouth of the alley, alone, no weapon in his hand, no one beside him, at least no one Jolene could see. His men were 1 alley away, 2 of them, ready, only waiting for a signal. But Kendrick didn't call them. He stepped forward alone, because this wasn't a deal, wasn't territory, wasn't money. This was Jolene, and he had decided 4 nights earlier that, if this happened, He would be the one standing here. He walked past the two men and stood between them and Jolene. His back was to her, his face was toward them, and Jolene, from behind him, looked at that back, broad, straight, standing between her and something dangerous, and she realized that this was the first time in her life a man had placed his own body between her and harm. The shorter of the two men pulled a knife. Jolene saw the flash of metal beneath the streetlight. Her heart missed a beat, but Kendrick didn't step back. He didn't even look at the knife. He looked straight into the eyes of the man holding it and said, in a level voice, in the same voice he might have used to talk about the weather, in the voice whose calmness was itself the most frightening thing about it, "You've got one knife. I've got this whole city. You do the math and tell me which one weighs more." Silence. 2 seconds. 3. The man with the knife looked at Kendrick, looked into those eyes, and lowered his hand. The taller man grabbed his friend's shoulder and pulled him back. They turned, got into the car, shut the doors. The engine started, the car backed out of the alley, and disappeared onto the main road. Fast. Silent. The alley was empty. Only Kendrick and Jolene remained. He turned around. Jolene was leaning against the wall, both hands still clenched around the strap of her bag, her shoulders shaking. Not from the cold, from the fact that 3 minutes earlier she had almost been dragged into a world she didn't understand and didn't belong to. Kendrick looked at her. He didn't say, "Are you okay?" He didn't ask anything. He took off his coat, stepped closer, and draped it over her shoulders. Then he stood beside her, silent, his back against the wall, his eyes on the mouth of the alley, and waited. Waited for her to settle. Waited for her shoulders to stop shaking. Waited, because sometimes what a person needs isn't words, but the quiet presence of someone standing close enough for her to know she isn't alone. Jolene drew in a long breath, then another. Her shoulders slowly stopped shaking. She looked over at Kendrick, at the side of his face in the weak streetlight, and asked, "Did you know they were coming?" "I suspected it," he said, his eyes still on the alley entrance. "Then why were you standing here alone? Where were your men?" Kendrick was silent, longer than usual. Then he spoke, and Jolene heard in his voice something she had never heard before. Not coldness, not control, but something truer, closer, softer. "There are some things I don't hand off to anyone else." Jolene looked at him, and she understood. She understood that this man, the man the whole city feared, the man who could make one phone call and have 30 people appear in 10 minutes, had chosen to stand alone in a dark alley, without anyone beside him, with nothing but his hands and those eyes that made even the man holding a knife lower it. He chose to stand here. For her. Not because of a debt. Not because of his mother. For her. Tears ran down Jolene's face. Not because she was afraid. The fear had already passed. She cried because for the first time in her life, a man had put himself in real danger for her. Not by standing in front of 200 people and saying beautiful things. Not by performing some public confession to win a bet. But by standing in a dark alley, alone, facing a knife, because he didn't want her to be harmed. The difference between what Trent had done and what Kendrick had just done was so vast she couldn't find words large enough to hold it. Kendrick looked at her crying. He didn't wipe away her tears. He didn't pull her into an embrace. He only said, softly, in a voice so quiet she had to tilt her head to hear it clearly, "You could have been hurt too when you helped my mother that year, but you stayed anyway." Jolene said nothing. She stood in the dark alley wearing the coat of the most powerful crime boss on Chicago's South Side, tears on her face, and for the first time, she truly understood the difference between a man who performs love before a crowd and a man who lives love in an alley where no one is watching. Jolene wasn't someone who overlooked details. She was the kind of woman who had spent years behind a reception desk, observing, taking note, fitting pieces together, reading people by watching them when they believed no one was looking. And after the night in the alley, once the fear had settled and her mind began working again, the pieces started slipping into place on their own. She started with the small things. Trent Holloway had vanished from Chicago, and no one knew where he had gone. And before disappearing, he had posted a public apology on social media, something Trent Holloway, with an ego as large as the entire car dealership where he worked, would never have done willingly. The video had been removed overnight, cleanly, as though it had never existed, even though it had been shared thousands of times before that, and there was no way to erase something that thoroughly from the internet, unless you had the power to pressure the platforms themselves. Her former boss had suddenly become polite. Her coworkers had stopped talking behind her back. Small, quiet changes she had already noticed before, but at the time, hadn't known how to connect. Then there was the night in the alley. The two men, they said Shaw, they said Kessler. They said those names as though they needed no explanation because everyone already knew them. And when Kendrick stepped out, they didn't run because he was bigger than they were or because he had a weapon. They ran because they saw his face and knew exactly who was standing in front of them. Jolene sat at the kitchen table in her third-floor apartment on the morning after that night and began looking into it, not through a private investigator or a detective, through the way anyone with internet access and the ability to ask the right questions could do it. She searched Kendrick Shaw's name online. She asked Corinne, whose brother worked in real estate, and knew a little about the big names on the South Side. She pieced the fragments together, and the picture didn't emerge one piece at a time, but all at once, the way a blurred image suddenly snaps into focus, and everything becomes sharp in the same instant. Kendrick Shaw wasn't only the owner of a restaurant chain. He was the crime boss who controlled much of the business moving through the shadows of Chicago's South Side. The restaurant where her company's party had been held, the restaurant he had stepped out from through the back door that night, belonged to him. The man who had offered his hand to help her up, who had brought her coffee exactly the way she drank it, who had stood alone in a dark alley between her and a knife, was one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the city. Jolene set her phone down on the table, and she wasn't afraid. That was the strangest part. She thought she would be. She thought that when she learned the truth, the first thing she would feel would be fear. The fear of someone realizing she had been standing beside a cliff without knowing it. But no. What she felt wasn't fear. It was closer to exhaustion, closer to the deep, heavy disappointment of someone who had opened her heart for the second time in her life, and for the second time discovered that the person she trusted hadn't given her the truth. She thought of Trent. Trent had hidden the bet. Trent had laughed behind her back. Trent had turned her feelings into a $500 joke. Then she thought of Kendrick. Kendrick had hidden who he truly was. Every time he met with her, every coffee, every conversation, every silent moment in the car, he had sat there carrying half the truth while hiding the other half. Two men, two different kinds of concealment, but the result was the same. She had once again been the last one to know. She sat alone in the small kitchen, the morning light falling through the window, and she asked herself a question. Every time she opened herself to someone, she ended up standing in front of a truth she had never been prepared for. The first time it was a bet. This time it was an entire criminal life. She wondered whether she was repeating the same cycle, opening up, being deceived, collapsing, building the wall again, then opening once more because another man said the right things, did the right things, and she believed again, and was wrong again, but then she stopped herself there, because it wasn't completely true. And Jolene, even while hurting, was still the kind of person who could tell the difference between almost true and true. Trent had hidden the bet because he saw her as a game. Kendrick had hidden his identity for what reason? She didn't know yet. She hadn't heard him say it. And Jolene, who had learned the painful lesson of drawing conclusions before she had enough information, decided that she wouldn't conclude anything. Not yet. But she also wouldn't pretend she didn't know. She picked up her phone, opened her contacts, and found Kendrick's name. She looked at it on the screen for a few seconds, then she pressed call. He answered after the first ring, and that told her he had been waiting. Perhaps he had known this call would come. Perhaps he had been expecting it for a long time. Jolene spoke in a calm voice, steady, not raised, the same voice she had used on the night of the party when she stood in front of Trent. The voice of someone who had already made her decision. I know who you are. Come see me. And this time, don't hide anything. There was silence on the other end for 3 seconds. Then Kendrick said, I'm coming. Kendrick arrived at Jolene's apartment 20 minutes after the call. He knocked on the door, not the bell, 2 short knocks, and Jolene opened it, then stepped aside to let him in without saying a word. She had pulled 2 chairs out to face each other at the small kitchen table. There was no coffee on the table. No water. Nothing except the 2 chairs and the empty space between them. She sat down in one chair. Kendrick looked at the other chair and sat, and for the first time since Jolene had known him, she saw Kendrick Shaw sitting without ease, not restless, not afraid, only sitting like a man who knew he was about to lose control of the conversation, and he wasn't used to that. Jolene looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them spoke for about 10 seconds, and those 10 seconds felt heavier than the entire evening in the alley. Then Jolene spoke. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. Her voice was flat, clear, the kind of voice she used when she had already thought everything through, and every word had been chosen before it left her mouth. I was deceived by one man with sweet words. He stood in front of me, in front of 200 people, and said the words I had wanted to hear my whole life, and all of it was false. Now I find out that the second man, the one I had begun to trust, the one I let come closer than anyone since that happened, hid an entire second life from me. She paused, looked straight into Kendrick's eyes. What am I in the eyes of men like you? What am I? Someone you think doesn't need to know the truth? Kendrick didn't deny it. He didn't say, "You've misunderstood," or "Let me explain," or any of the other things another man might have said to buy himself more time. He sat there and took every sentence she gave him, and Jolene saw something on his face she hadn't expected to see. Not anger, not defense, but something closer to pain. The kind of pain belonging to a man who knows he was wrong and has no excuse good enough to cover it. He was silent. A long time. Long enough that Jolene thought he might never speak. Then he did, and his voice was different. Not the voice he had used with Walton in the restaurant. Not the voice he had used with Trent on the night the restaurant was closed. Not the voice he had used with the two men in the alley. This was a voice Jolene had never heard before. The voice of a man who had set everything down, every layer, every wall, and was speaking from something underneath it all. Something he didn't let anyone see. "I didn't hide it to deceive you." He spoke slowly, word by word, as though each one cost him something. "I hid it, because if you knew who I was, you would look at me the way everyone else does." He stopped. "Everyone looks at me with fear, or calculation, or with that false kind of respect people give a man they fear but don't dare admit they fear. No one looks at me normally. No one talks to me without weighing every word because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. No one sits beside me and is truly at ease." He looked at Jolene. "Then you came along. You looked at me and you weren't afraid. You asked me direct questions. You argued with me when you disagreed. You treated me like an ordinary man. And I—" He paused, swallowed, as though the next word was heavier than he had expected. "I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you would stop doing that. You would look at me with the same fear everyone else does, and I would lose the only person who sees me as normal." The kitchen was silent. The morning light still came through the window, still fell across the table, still looked ordinary, but the air in the room was nothing close to ordinary, because this was Kendrick Shaw, the man no one on the South Side dared speak of lightly, sitting in an old kitchen chair in a third-floor apartment, across from a 27-year-old woman, admitting that he was afraid. Not afraid of a knife, not afraid of his enemies, afraid of losing the way she looked at him. The most powerful crime boss in the city, and the one thing that could make him shake wasn't anything from the underworld. It was the possibility that the woman sitting across from him would see him differently. Jolene listened to all of it. She heard every word and believed he was telling the truth. Because Jolene was someone who had learned to tell the difference between truth and falsehood at the highest price possible, and she knew that what Kendrick had just said wasn't a script. No one could perform that faint tremor in the voice on the final word. No one could fake the look of a man opening the lid on something he had kept sealed his entire life. But she didn't forgive him right away. Because Jolene Webb wasn't the kind of person who made decisions while her emotions were at their highest. She had done that once, at the party, when she nodded in 10 seconds, and she had paid for it. She wouldn't repeat it. "I heard what you said," she told him. "I don't know how much I can trust yet. Not because you're lying, but because I need time to know what I feel." She looked at him. "I need time." Kendrick nodded, one slow nod. He didn't say, "How long?" He didn't say, "I'll wait." He only nodded, stood up, pushed the chair back under the table, and walked toward the door. He had his hand on the doorknob when Jolene said, "Kendrick." He stopped, turned back. Jolene looked at him, and on her face was something she didn't hide. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close to recognition. An acknowledgement that she had seen him, truly seen him, not as the crime boss, not as the man who hid things, but as the man who had stood in the dark alley. "Thank you for standing in that alley," she said. Kendrick looked at her, nodded. Then he opened the door and left. He didn't look back. His footsteps in the hallway sounded steady and even, the way they always did. But Jolene knew. in the way she knew things, through observation, through the small details others missed, that the man who had just walked out of her apartment was carrying more with him than he had brought in. She closed the door, sat down again, looked at the empty chair across from her, the one Kendrick had just left. She didn't cry. She had cried enough. This time she only thought for a very long time, and in the silence of the small kitchen, she let the biggest question remain there in front of her without rushing to answer it. She let it remain, because some questions need time, and this time, Jolene was going to give herself enough of it. Jolene spent 4 days alone. She didn't call anyone. She didn't see anyone. She went to work, came home, sat at the kitchen table, and thought. She thought the way she always did when facing a decision that mattered, not with emotion, but by placing everything in front of her and looking at it clearly. She thought about Trent, not for long, not in depth, just enough to remind herself that she knew what a lie looked like when it dressed itself up as love. Trent had been the man who stood in front of her and said the right words in the right tone at the right moment, and every part of it had been scripted. She had already dealt with Trent. He no longer occupied space in her mind, except as a lesson she had paid dearly to learn. Then she thought about Kendrick. And that part was harder, because Kendrick didn't fit into any pattern she had known before. He didn't use sweet words. He brought her the exact coffee she drank without asking. He remembered her peanut allergy and called the chef without telling her. He looked at her for weeks and never once commented on her appearance. He stood alone in a dark alley with his back between her and a knife, and when she asked why, he said, "There are some things I don't hand off to anyone else." And when she asked why he had hidden the truth, he didn't justify, didn't deflect. He said he was afraid of losing the way she saw him, the most powerful man in the city, and the thing he feared losing wasn't money or territory. It was her gaze. Jolene wasn't the kind of person moved by words. She had been moved once, and she had paid for it. But she also wasn't the kind who denied evidence. And the evidence here wasn't what Kendrick said. It was what he had done. Every action, every small detail. Every quiet moment when he chose to be present instead of filling the space with empty sentences. Trent had given her words and hidden his actions. Kendrick had given her actions and hidden his words. And when she placed those two things side by side and looked, she knew which one carried more weight. On the third day, she remembered Ruth, not the entire meeting. Just one sentence. The sentence the older woman had spoken while holding her hands in that small kitchen. "You don't need anyone to tell you you're beautiful in order to have value." She remembered it and felt its weight again, the kind that doesn't fade with time but sinks deeper. On the fourth day, she thought about the 16-year-old girl, the girl who had run toward a stranger lying on the sidewalk on Ashland while no one else stopped. That girl hadn't been afraid. She hadn't calculated. She had seen someone who needed help, and she had sat down. That was all. And that girl, Jolene realized, was still her, still there inside her, even after being judged, turned into a joke, knocked down, buried under thousands of cruel comments. That 16-year-old girl remained, still the one who didn't walk away when everyone else did, still the one who chose to stay. On the evening of the fourth day, Jolene called Kendrick. "Come here." He came, faster than the last time. She opened the door, and this time there were 2 glasses of water on the kitchen table, a small change that Kendrick noticed immediately, because he noticed everything. They sat, the same 2 chairs, the same space between them, but the air was different. Jolene spoke. "I won't run. I won't walk away. But I also won't pretend I don't know who you are and what kind of world you live in." She looked straight into his eyes. "If you want to be with me, I have one condition. Don't ever decide for me again. Don't protect me from a distance without telling me. Don't hide the truth because you think I'm not strong enough to hear it. I've lived my whole life with other people deciding what I deserve." She paused. "You don't get to do that." Kendrick listened. Every word. And Jolene saw something on his face she hadn't seen before in any of their meetings. Something that broke and reassembled itself in a single moment. Quick and quiet, like a door opening and closing at the same time. He was a man no one set conditions for. In his world, he made the rules. He was the one who said 12 hours, and people obeyed. He was the one who nodded and things moved. No one had ever sat across from him, looked him in the eye, and said, "You don't get to do that." No one. Until Jolene. He said, "Okay, one word." No explanation. No long promise. No "I'll try" or "I'll change." Just okay. And Jolene, who had learned to read people by what they didn't say, understood that one word from Kendrick Shaw carried more weight than any speech another man could have given. She nodded, and she knew, she could feel it, that this nod was different from the one at the party, when she had stood in front of 200 people and said yes because she wanted to believe too much. That nod had belonged to a 27-year-old woman who had longed to be loved for years and was willing to break every wall to reach for it. The nod she gave now belonged to a woman who had been betrayed, knocked down, laughed at in front of thousands, who had uncovered a hidden truth, who had spent 4 days alone thinking, and after all of it, after seeing everything clearly, knowing everything, understanding every risk, still chose to step forward, not because she needed someone to save her, but because she was the kind of person who chose to stay. One quiet evening, a few days after Jolene had set her condition and Kendrick had said okay, he sat at the kitchen table in her apartment. It wasn't the first time he had sat there, but this time was different. This time there were no questions hanging between them, no truths waiting to be uncovered, no conflict left that needed to be resolved. There were only two people sitting in a small kitchen, 2 glasses of water on the table, and the silence they had both learned how to be comfortable inside. Kendrick placed his hand on the table. Then he did something he had been thinking about for days but hadn't found the right moment for. Maybe there isn't a right moment for things like this. Maybe you just have to do them. He opened his wallet, pulled a photograph from the smallest compartment, set it on the table, and gently slid it toward Jolene. It was a student identification photo. Old, faded, the corner curled and yellowed with age. In the picture was a 16-year-old girl, her hair tied off to one side, her face rounder than it was now, wearing a wrinkled school uniform, looking straight into the camera with the expression of a child who didn't know how to pose for an identification photo and didn't care to learn. "I've kept it for 11 years, Kendrick said. Jolene looked at the photograph on the table. She didn't pick it up right away. She just looked at it lying there on the worn wood beneath the kitchen light, and she recognized the face in it. It took a few seconds, because she hadn't looked at herself at 16 in a very long time, and the girl in the picture looked like someone else, someone she had almost forgotten. Rounder. Smaller, her hair tied unevenly, because that girl had never been patient enough to tie it neatly. The eyes hadn't changed, the same direct eyes, the eyes of someone who hadn't yet been taught by the world how to lower them. She picked up the photograph, held it with both hands, gently, as though it were more fragile than it looked. She looked at her own face at 16 and thought about that afternoon on Ashland. That girl hadn't known who the woman lying on the sidewalk was, hadn't known the woman had a son, hadn't known what kind of man that son would grow up to become. That girl had only seen someone lying there who needed help, and she had stopped. No calculation, no hesitation, no wondering what she would get in return. She had simply sat down, taken the woman's hand, and stayed. That girl didn't know who she was saving, Jolene said softly, her eyes still on the photograph. She only did what was right. Kendrick watched her holding the picture, and on his face was something that in another man might have been called tenderness. But because this was Kendrick Shaw, it looked more like the expression of someone looking at something so precious that he had to be careful even in the way he looked at it. "That's why I kept it," he said. "Not because you saved my mother. Because you're the kind of person who does what's right when no one is watching, when no one says thank you, when no one remembers." The kitchen fell silent. Jolene looked at the photograph for a long time. Her fingers touched the curled corner, the yellowed edge, the marks left by 11 years in the wallet of a man she hadn't even known existed. 11 years. This photograph had gone through how many late-night meetings, how many heavy decisions, how many nights Kendrick had sat alone in an empty restaurant and opened his wallet to look at it. She didn't know those things, but she could feel the weight of them in the way the photograph had aged, had worn down, had been handled so many times that the ink had started fading where fingers usually rested. She placed the photograph back on the table, but she didn't slide it back toward Kendrick. She let it remain in front of her, close to her. Kendrick watched her do that, and he understood. She was keeping it there. Jolene looked at the photograph on the table, then looked up at Kendrick. And between them, in that small kitchen, there were no grand promises. No "I love you." No "we'll be together forever." None of the things movies tell you this is the moment to say. There was only an old-school photograph lying on the table, and two people sitting across from each other, and the truth that the 16-year-old girl in that picture, the girl the world had only seen by her weight, the girl no one imagined anyone would ever confess love to, the girl Trent Holloway had bet $500 would say yes out of gratitude and desperation. That girl had saved a life with her bare hands and a heart that didn't calculate. And the person she saved had, 11 years later, given life to a man sitting here in front of her, looking at her with the eyes the whole city feared. And yet when he looked at her, there was only one thing in them: gratitude. Not gratitude for a debt, gratitude that she existed, gratitude that she was herself. Kendrick watched Jolene keep the photograph in front of her, and he understood that this wasn't an ending. Nothing was ending tonight. This was the beginning of something he had never had and didn't know how to name. Someone who wasn't afraid of him. Someone who needed nothing from him. Someone who had seen him, truly seen him, both the light and the dark, both the crime boss and the man trembling in a dark alley because he was afraid of losing her, and after all of that, still chose to sit here, still chose to let the photograph remain in front of her instead of pushing it away. Jolene looked down at the photograph one last time. The 16-year-old girl looked back at her from the faded paper, straight eyes, unlowered eyes, and Jolene understood that girl had given her more than she had ever known. Not only 11 more years for Ruth, that girl had given Jolene a reminder that her worth had never lived in the way other people looked at her. It had always lived in what she chose to do when no one was watching. This is Jolene Webb's story. The story of a girl who was judged by her weight all her life before anyone ever stopped long enough to see who she truly was. The story of a girl turned into a $500 bet by a man who treated her feelings like the cheapest thing in the room. The story of a girl shoved to the ground in front of 200 people while not a single hand reached out to help her. The story of a girl mocked online by thousands of strangers, none of whom knew the first thing about who she was. And still, she didn't break. Not because she was strong in the way the world likes to define strength. Not because she was hard or cold or unable to feel pain, but because she was the kind of person who, at 16 years old, sat down beside a stranger on a sidewalk while dozens of people walked past without stopping. And that kind of person, the kind who does what is right when no one is watching, when no one says thank you, when no one remembers, that kind of person doesn't fall apart easily. There are people who spend their whole lives being seen the wrong way, but their value doesn't live in who sees them. It lives in what they choose to do when no one is looking. If this story made you remember a time when you were judged unfairly, please press like so more people can hear it. Share it with someone who needs to know that their value doesn't live in the eyes of other people. And subscribe to our channel, because the stories coming next carry even more weight than this one. We'd truly love to know where this story touched you and how you felt after hearing it. So please leave a comment below and share whatever is sitting deep in your heart. We read every line and treasure every word. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every single day. Thank you for being here. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.